Every single day you feel it, don't you? That kind of quiet heaviness you never really talk about. You know the drill. You scroll on your phone, you distract yourself, you whisper, all right, just 5 more minutes. Because deep down, there's something you know you absolutely should do today. Maybe it's that awkward conversation you keep dodging, like finally telling someone you just aren't happy, or that project you've been talking about launching for literally years. But the second you actually think about doing it, your stomach just ties into knots. So what do? You push it to later. But the thing about later is it eventually catches up. And this tiny, invisible habit, it slowly snowballs until it becomes the single biggest obstacle in your entire life. Well, it's time we finally talked about it. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to unpack some seriously eye-opening concepts from Brianna Wiest's work, The Mountain is You. And the main takeaway today is honestly a total game changer. It's this. You aren't lazy, you aren't broken, and no, you don't just lack discipline. That invisible force dragging you down is actually your own brain, working overtime to protect you from change. And I promise you, once you understand how this internal wiring actually works, it changes absolutely everything about your trajectory. So to figure out how to dismantle these self-sabotaging behaviors, we're going to treat this like an expedition up that mountain. We'll start at base camp to look at the problem, grab the map to understand the mechanism, use the compass to decode our emotions, make the ascent by taking real action, and finally reach the summit for self-mastery. Let's get right into it.
Stop 1. Base camp. The exact nature of the problem. You know, we're all basically conditioned to think that if we're self-sabotaging, it just means we're lazy. End of story. But from a psychological standpoint, that's completely false. This massive mountain blocking your path is actually built out of unmet needs, emotions you've been actively avoiding, and fears shaped by your past. The psychologist Carl Jung actually had a famous take on this. He explains that your unconscious mind will literally do anything to keep you in a familiar zone. Even, and this is the wild part, even if that familiar zone makes you completely miserable. Your subconscious looks at any change and just sees danger, so it hits the brakes and sabotages you just to keep you safe.
Which brings us to a really tough pill to swallow. Brianna Wiest puts it perfectly when she says, everything begins with honesty. It's easier to blame life than to face the fears and beliefs that built the mountain inside you. Because think about it, the more you sabotage yourself, the more you start to lock into this fixed identity. You start telling yourself, oh, I'm just not a disciplined person, or I always ruin things, that's just what I do. To snap out of this, the very first absolutely crucial step you have to take is to get it out of your head and write it down. Write out exactly what isn't working. List out your fears. Put down those things you're completely terrified to say out loud. By forcing it onto a physical page, you're ripping that vague, terrifying anxiety out of your mind and giving it a real structure that you can actually start to work with.
Moving on to step 2 on our expedition, the map. Let's look at the actual mechanism of sabotage.
So here is the literal map of how we self-sabotage. It almost always kicks off with a core emotional need or a fear that's just not being met. And because feeling that way hurts, your subconscious steps in and creates a protective behavior. Its only job is to shield you from that pain. But here is the massive irony. That exact protective behavior is what ends up tanking your progress. And what happens next? That sabotage totally reinforces your old, stuck identity, which then just makes the original fear even stronger. It's an endless loop. You get a new job, but you bring the exact same doubt. You set a new goal, but you hit the exact same hesitation. To really put this into perspective, think about how this actually plays out in everyday life. Take overworking, for example. We love to call it ambition, right? But a lot of the time, it's just a hidden, subconscious attempt to run away from feeling lonely. And the resulting sabotage? You end up ruining the very relationships that would actually cure that loneliness. Or how about overspending? Sure, it gives you a quick rush, makes you feel alive for a second, but it completely destroys the long-term stability you desperately need to feel secure. Even constantly seeking validation from others, it usually hides the fact that you aren't actually happy with your career or life, and it chips away at your ability to trust yourself. These aren't just random mistakes. They are unconscious commitments to staying safe, keeping you totally locked in the cycle.
Okay, that brings us to step 3, the compass. How to decode your emotional signals.
Now, society is pretty much always telling us to shove our negative emotions down, to just calm down and move on. But your emotions aren't threats you need to suppress. They're actually a compass, pointing directly at what needs your attention. To actually use this compass, though, you have to know how to distinguish between 2 totally different voices inside your head. Your genuine intuition, that voice is calm, clear, and stable. Even if the truth it's telling you is incredibly difficult to hear, it doesn't panic. On the flip side, Emotional reactions from past baggage or intrusive thoughts driven by anxiety, those are going to feel loud, panicked, confusing, and super urgent. Honestly, learning how to tell the difference between these two signals is the absolute cornerstone of emotional intelligence.
Which leads us to step 4, the ascent. Time to start taking action. Now, I really have to warn you about something. The exact second you actually decide to change, like the day you finally open up that laptop or walk through the doors of the gym, everything inside your body is going to scream no. You're going to feel this sudden quiet panic. In psychology, this is known as homeostasis and adjustment shock. Your entire nervous system is literally hardwired to keep things exactly as they are. So when you try to shift that, your system reacts like you've just set off a 5-alarm fire, just because you decided to put on some running shoes. It freaks out because it's losing the familiar routine it was banking on. But you need to hear this. That intense discomfort is absolutely not a sign that you're failing or that you should just throw in the towel. It's biological proof that your brain is actively unlearning old patterns. That discomfort is literally the signal that growth is happening. But because your brain absolutely hates abrupt change, you can't just flip your entire life upside down in one giant leap. It never works. Instead, you have to bypass your brain's panic response by using what Wiest calls micro-revolutions. We're talking tiny steps here. You leave work just 10 minutes earlier. You go for a walk for literally 5 minutes a day. You challenge yourself to save just $5 before you even think about trying to save $500. These incredibly small, predictable steps fly right under the radar. They don't trigger that massive adjustment shock. Instead, they build momentum. And that momentum starts building a brand new identity, which is what actually leads to lasting transformation. You have to act before you feel ready, and just trust that the motivation will catch up. And finally, step 5, the summit, reaching self-mastery. The harsh truth is, you're never going to make it to the summit if you're dragging a massive backpack full of unhealed memories up the mountain with you. To actually master yourself, you have to look backward for a minute and comfort your younger self. You have to let go of those impossible standards you built back then just to survive. Then you look forward. Neuroscience tells us that visualization isn't just self-help fluff. It literally gives your brain a new reference point. You need to rehearse the future version of yourself. How do they think? What do they absolutely refuse to tolerate? And then, right now, in the present moment, you stop waiting around to magically become that person, and you just start making micro-choices that align with that future identity today. To really anchor this new identity so you don't just slide right back down the mountain, you're going to need 4 main pillars of support. First step, you have to self-validate your own emotions. Stop outsourcing your feelings. Name them, process them, but don't let them drive the car. Second, start relying on your principles instead of waiting for some fleeting burst of inspiration. Principles like consistency beats intensity are what keep you moving on those days when you really, really don't want to climb. Third, just let your purpose evolve naturally. You don't have to force some rigid, grand calling for your life right this second. And finally, use those negative emotions as a guide. When they pop up, they are showing you the exact spots that still need healing. When you start mastering these steps, you literally rewire that automatic loop of self-sabotage. You start responding to life intentionally instead of just reacting emotionally. And that right there, that builds an incredible amount of deep self-trust. So here's my question for you. The next time you hit a wall on your climb, I want you to stop asking, why is this happening to me? And instead ask yourself, what strength is this shaping in me? Because the reality is, there's no magical summit where you're suddenly just done growing. The climb itself is what makes life so deeply meaningful, because you are finally actively choosing growth over fear. You are stepping into the exact person you were always meant to become. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you on the next climb.